Hey everybody, we are going to continue on talking about plants and animals, and we are going to talk today about animal form and function. And so to start out, we want to figure out how do we talk about this. And so we're going to talk a little bit about anatomy and physiology. So anatomy is the study of the structure of an organism, and then physiology is the study of the functions of an organism or the parts of an organism. So animal form and function are correlated at all levels of organization. So most animals are composed of specialized cells that are then organized into tissues that have different functions. Now we can look at those tissues and see how they are then classified into four main categories. So epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscle tissue, and nervous tissue. So epithelial tissue is going to be the tissue that sort of surrounds the body, so like the inside lines the inside and the outside of the body. So that's a good way to remember epithelial. Connective tissue, we've got lots of different kinds. So loose connective tissue, cartilage, adipose or fat tissue. Your blood is considered connective tissue, as is bone, and then also fibrous connective tissue. We also have three different types of muscle tissue. So there's skeletal muscle. Those tend to be the muscles that you think about like when you're lifting weights. But then there's also cardiac muscle tissue, so that would be your heart, and then smooth muscle tissue that lines the internal organs. And then finally we have nervous tissue, and an example would be neurons. So then in all but the simplest animals, tissues are then organized into organs, and then you also have multiple organs working together to form an organ system. Here are the main organ systems and their functions in mammals. So this is from your book, so you guys can take a look at that. Now, animals use chemical energy in food to sustain form and function. So all organisms require chemical energy for things like growth, repair, all their physiological processes, regulation, and reproduction. So here is a diagram that sort of explains how that works. So you need to take in organic molecules in food. They're going to be digested and absorbed. They can then be used in body cells, so they will be used for things like cellular respiration to produce ATP. You can use the carbon skeletons. You can go through cellular respiration to produce ATP for energy for cellular work, or for energy for things like biosynthesis, growth, storage, and reproduction. But keep in mind, along every single step of the way, you're going to lose energy as heat, or you can also lose energy to things like feces and urine. All right, so now how do we talk about energy use in animals? We tend to talk about metabolic rates. And the metabolic rate is the amount of energy that an animal uses in a unit of time. So there's a couple ways to measure this. And the first way is that you could look at the amount of oxygen that is consumed or the amount of carbon dioxide that is produced. So here we are looking at a ghost crab and a respirometer. And so here we're holding the temperature constant with a known concentration of oxygen. And so the metabolic rate is going to be calculated by looking at the difference between the amount of oxygen entering and the amount of oxygen leaving the respirometer. But here we're looking at an athlete that is hooked up to a breathing apparatus that's monitoring him while he's exercising on a stationary bike. Now, there's a couple different bioenergetic strategies that animals can use. And so an animal's metabolic rate is very closely related to which of these bioenergetic strategies that is used. So birds and mammals are mainly endothermic, meaning that our bodies are warmed mostly by heat that we generate by metabolism. And so because of this, endotherms typically have a higher metabolic rate. Then you've got amphibians and reptiles other than birds that are ectothermic. And so ectotherms are going to gain their heat mostly from external sources, so they tend to have a lower metabolic rate. Now, when we're looking at metabolic rate, activity greatly affects metabolic rate. And so when we're talking about endotherms, we want to know their basal metabolic rate. And that is the metabolic rate of an endotherm at rest. And then the standard metabolic rate is the metabolic rate of an ectotherm at rest. Okay, so animals regulate their internal environment within relatively narrow limits. So we need to keep our insides within a pretty standard set of conditions. And so the internal environment of vertebrates, which is called the interstitial fluid, is going to be very different from the external environment, which tends to change pretty frequently. And so homeostasis is this balance between external changes and the animal's internal control mechanisms that oppose those changes. So how do we do this? How do we control these systems? The homeostatic control system tends to have three functional components: a receptor, a control center, and then an effector. And so we can look at these when we look at things like feedback loops. So we have the control center, which in this case would be like the set point on a thermostat. So this is our control center. We set our thermostat to a certain temperature that we want it to be. All right, and so that is, again, our control center. Then we have a receptor, and it's going to determine if it's too hot or too cold. So in this case, it's going to be too hot, so the heater is turned off. And so that's going to be our response, or the effector. And so the heat is going to get turned off. The room temperature then is going to decrease until it hits the set point again. Now this also works the other way. So if you set the control center to a certain temperature and it's too cold, then the heater will kick on. The response then is that heat is produced, the room temperature increases until it gets back to that set point. So we actually, that's a pretty fitting example, because as animals, thermoregulation is going to be really important. So thermoregulation, which is how we regulate our own internal temperature, contributes to homeostasis, and it involves anatomy, physiology, as well as behavior. And so again, thermoregulation is how animals maintain an internal temperature within what's considered a tolerable range, so we don't get too hot or too cold. So ectotherms, including most invertebrates, fishes, amphibians, and non-bird reptiles. And then we've got endotherms that include birds and mammals. So what's interesting is when you look at ectotherms, they can tolerate a much larger variation in internal temperature than endotherms. So in those endotherms, birds and mammals that we talked about earlier, we need to keep a much more narrow temperature range within our bodies. So if you take a look at this graph, it's comparing an otter, which is an endotherm, to a largemouth bass, which is an ectotherm. Now, the x-axis is the ambient or environmental temperature, and then the y-axis is the body temperature. So if you look at the river otter, it doesn't really matter what temperature water he's in. His body temperature is always fairly steady. However, the fish tends to vary greatly with the temperature of the water. So he's an ectotherm, and he can tolerate this large variation in internal temperature, and his internal temperature tends to vary with the environmental temperature, whereas again, the endotherm stays constant no matter what the temperature in the environment is. So endothermy is more energetically expensive than ectothermy, and it buffers an animal's internal temperatures against external fluctuations. So even if the temperature in the environment is fluctuating up and down, the internal temperature of an endotherm is going to stay very stable. It also enables the animal to maintain a high level of aerobic metabolism as well. Here we're looking at an ectotherm and essentially how they're getting heat. So you've got radiation from the sun. You also have conduction. So if you ever see like a snake or lizard sitting on a rock, they're actually getting heat from the rock as well. So they are much more susceptible to changes in temperature based on the temperature of the environment. So in thermoregulation, physiological and behavioral adjustments balance heat loss and heat gain. So there's 5 general adaptations that help animals thermoregulate. The first is insulation. Then you've also got different circulatory adaptations, cooling by evaporative heat loss, behavioral responses, and then adjusting metabolic heat production. What we're looking at here is an example of skin, actually. So this is the dermis in the middle, epidermis, and then the hypodermis. So this is a cross-section of human skin. Some things to kind of notice here. We've got adipose or fat tissue, so we've got some insulation there. We also have blood vessels that run through. We have hairs within our skin that are connected to a muscle, and this muscle is actually able to make the hairs on our skin stand up. Which is really important for controlling heat, especially in other mammals as well. And we have sweat pores, which in humans is really important for evaporative cooling. So our skin is really important to how we thermoregulate. There's also circulatory adaptations. So in vasodilation, blood flow in the skin increases, facilitating heat loss. So you can see here, here we have vasodilation. So the diameter of the blood vessel gets wider. compared to the normal vascular tone. And then you also have vasoconstriction, which is when blood flow in the skin decreasing, so it lowers heat loss. And so here is the vasoconstriction. You can see the diameter now is much smaller, and so it lowers heat loss. Cooling by evaporative heat loss is really important. So many types of animals lose heat through evaporation of water and sweat. You also have, if you guys have dogs at home, you'll see your dogs panting with their tongues kind of hanging out when they get hot. So panting augments the cooling effect in birds and many mammals. Then you also have bathing that moistens the skin and it essentially helps to cool an animal down. So there you have your elephant bathing himself so that he can cool down. You also have some types of insects that are able to adjust their metabolic heat production. So you've got species of flying insects that use shivering to warm up before they take flight. So you can see you've got the pre-flight, the temperature is fairly low. During your pre-flight warm-up with the shivering, you can see now that the thorax has warmed up quite substantially and the abdomen a little bit as well prior to flight. Okay, so back to feedback mechanisms and thermoregulation. So mammals regulate body temperature by negative feedback that involves several organ systems. In humans, we've got the hypothalamus, which is a part of the brain that contains nerve cells to function as a thermostat. And so here we have the thermostat and the hypothalamus will activate cooling mechanisms. So you've got sweat glands that will secrete sweat, which will then evaporate and cool the body. Blood vessels in the skin will dilate. And so heat will radiate from the skin surface. And so what that does is it decreases body temperature. The thermostat shuts off the cooling mechanisms. And so now we have our internal body temperature maintained. And then again, when you have the increase in body temperature, the hypothalamus is going to signal all of that to start again. Okay, so that is if you are needing to cool down. If you are in cold surroundings now, the hypothalamus is going to activate the warming mechanism. So we would have vasoconstriction. We would also have skeletal muscles that rapidly contract, which causes us to shiver. Both of those would cause the body temperature to increase. The thermostat would then essentially shut off the warming mechanisms, and we again have maintained our internal temperature. So how is it that other animals can adjust to changing temperatures? Well, it's through a process called acclimatization. Many animals can adjust to a new range of environmental temperatures over a period of days or weeks. So here what you see is the fitness level over in time. And so you can see if you got a really high fitness level, and you introduce an animal into a new environment, fitness level drops, right? It goes pretty low, and then over time, the fitness level will increase again as acclimatization begins. So if you guys take bio in college, you'll do some interesting experiments with that. Next, we've got torpor and energy conservation. This is a state in which activity is low and metabolism decreases. So hibernation is an example of long-term torpor. Estivation or summer torpor enables animals to survive long periods of high temperatures and scarce water supplies. Daily torpor is exhibited by small mammals and birds, and that is kind of seems pretty well adapted to feeding patterns as well. So your lecture question for today, I would just like you guys to compare and contrast the energy needs of ectotherms and endotherms. So please send me a message via the class website with just kind of comparing the two general categories. All right, thanks guys.